Hello, hello. Welcome to the latest episode of Better Humans at Work. I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Eric Surface, and we're going to geek out over evaluating DEI training programs. So thanks so much for joining us today, Eric.
Well, thank you. It's been a while since I've seen you. I guess maybe a few months. PSYOP was the last time that we saw each other. It's always good to sit down and have a conversation about important things. Glad to be here. Always trying to be a better human. So I like the thing, the concept.
Love it, love it. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about what you do and your background with our audience today?
Sure. I've had an interesting journey from the perspective. Like you. I'm an industrial and organizational psychologist. Started out doing work with had a different companies as internships. Another graduate student and I started our own consulting business in graduate school. At the same time, I was doing a research fellowship with the Army Research Institute for the Social and Behavioral Sciences. Then went and did a postdoc with them. And after that, ended up starting doing contracting work with the government. Most of my work has been in areas that involve a lot of measurement and feedback. So think about organizational effectiveness, organizational development surveys, think about training and development evaluation, think about 360, those types of things. I've had experience developing, evaluating all of those types of instruments and running programs to do them, including massive feedback programs in organizations built around their, and back in the day, they used to call them climate surveys or culture surveys. Now they call them engagement surveys, but basically the same things are being, with a few tweaks and a few ways of approaching it, are being measured today. And then I just continued into learning and development, evaluation in a big way. We did that as a kind of a consulting firm for a long time. And then we started, when things moved online, we started a feedback or a data collection feedback platform that we use just with our clients. And then after the sequester and budget cuts in the 15-16 time frame, because we were doing a lot of government work, we decided to kind of shift our emphasis to more of doing other things. Took us a while to figure that out, and we decided about 2019 we were going to become a platform company that offered software and consulting. So we have a measurement platform that does measurement, feedback, analytics, can do tremendous things in organizations, from training evaluations to surveys to 360s. And it's designed from the perspective of someone who does consulting, either internal to an organization or external to an organization. So that's kind of where our niche is there. We still do consulting and research projects, but the main focus is building out the platform.
So a lot of our audience is in the DEI space, diversity, equity, inclusion space, and training is a major, lever of the type of work that DEI practitioners do. And why do you think DEI training evaluation is so important? Because it kind of boggles my mind how much training is out there, but how infrequently it's evaluated. So what's the case for evaluating DEI training programs in your opinion?
Well, I think it's very similar to the case for evaluating any training program or any intervention in an organization. I think it's particularly important, though, if you want to have, let's say, if you want to develop kind of evidence or credibility in your organization, to do it. And one of the things that I think that is kind of a sad state, and a lot of people are working to change it, is a lot of training evaluation is check the box. And it's not a lot of thought is put into it. And that's mostly because people think about measuring different types of data, like the levels that you would see from some of the models out there, as opposed to really thinking about what stakeholders care about and what their questions they're interested in. Kurt Prager and I, a few years ago, developed a kind of a model we call it AIM, Alignment and Impact Model. And where it really, and I've put it into practice over the last, I'd say, 4 years in different scenarios with different clients. And what it is it's really interested is you think about the purpose and the stakeholders that you're supporting, and then what their key questions are, and all of us really have some form of two key questions. It's how well did it work, whatever it is, based on whatever I care about, the metric that I care about, right? And if it didn't work to my level of satisfaction, how can I improve it? And so if you think about it from that standpoint, everybody has something that they, that's in an organization has something that they care about related to learning and development, and in particularly for DEI or areas that have become so important to business strategy, um, and also customer facing strategy for a lot of organizations. So when I think you think about this, you have to think about what's the purpose. From a lot of people think about, oh great, it's I just can collect something at the end of training and I can get how people are satisfied with it. Well, that's a answer to a question for some stakeholders, right? If your question is what's the impact of that training, then you have to think about it from a broader perspective. So I would encourage anyone doing DEI perspective or DEI training to first think about, what are you doing the training for in the first place? What's the goal of the organization, and what are the metrics that would help you to measure that goal? Who the stakeholders are who care about those? What are they interested in seeing, and what do they need to see to make better decisions? From my perspective, there's a couple of different buckets that training should be measured in if you're interested or you have a stakeholder that's interested. One is broadly called effectiveness, which can be into lots of different things. Another is utilization, which is what a lot of LMS learning management systems do, is utilization. The other one is kind of administrative from an L&D perspective, resourcing and making decisions about training. Another strategic from an organizational perspective, and others compliance. I've worked with several clients who have external compliance requirements that they have to make because of some of their training. And then a big bucket that a lot of people don't think about for training is marketing. And that could be internal to their organization and external to it. So one of the things I think that sets DEI apart is that not only are you interested in the effectiveness of the training, but you're also interested in its strategic impact. And its strategic impact can be in different levels. Whereas you think about skill-based training, okay, the strategic impact there is you're trying to build the capabilities of a workforce around a certain skill that's necessary to perform their job or mission, right? So there's a very clear line, kind of a narrow focus on that. When you think about DEI, it's one of those things that can affect every aspect of an organization and every aspect of the employment relationship and the customer facing relationship. So it's got a larger strategic purpose. So I think that's where it's kind of different than most training evaluation, but in mechanism wise, is what you're doing achieving your goals, right? And so what do you need, and who cares about that? And so what do you need to measure to demonstrate that?
So a really common problem in the DEI space is getting senior leader buy-in, executive level buy-in to DEI, and thinking about this strategic alignment. In what ways have you seen, evaluation of training programs help increase that buy-in into overall initiatives? I'm just trying to kind of connect the dots with strategic alignment and executive level buy-in and training evaluation.
So I think this goes back to what I was saying before. Different stakeholders care about different things, and it's clear that there's a lot of stakeholders that they use the term ROI for return on investment when they really mean impact, because not everything has a financial. You cannot calculate a financial return. Technically, ROI is a financial return. And so for a lot of things, you cannot calculate a financial return directly. There are lots of indirect effects. And so it depends on what they care about and what their problems are. Is the problem, is it a passion for them? Is it something that they care about, as that they want to change in their organization or change in society? Then it's a very different set of, I think, things that they want to see. Is it someone who needs to be convinced that it's good for a business case? Okay, great. What are their organizational key results that they care about? What are their KPIs that they care about? And in general, what's the mechanism for the diversity the DEI initiative for impacting those metrics. Because I'll tell you, a lot of people, I think when they approach training evaluation, don't understand that you cannot change behavior with a 30-minute awareness course, right? You cannot, there's just certain things that the training cannot do. And so you have to keep in mind the scope of it. And then you also have to keep in mind how things work in organizations. So when you're doing training and development, you're building capabilities at the individual, team, organizational level. How are those capabilities actually aligned with the work that needs to be done, the mission that needs to be done? Are they aligned with the culture, the context in which they're being done? Because all of those things, if they're not, are going to cause the skills not to transfer, even if they were, mastered in training, right? Or the information to not to transfer because there's just nowhere to use it. And so are there things in the environment that work against it? So training evaluation is thinking holistically about this stuff. And I think a good example, and I know this is a DEI, but I want to make it clear for all your viewers, what is an example where it's crystal clear? Sales training. Sales training has a very clear line of sight from training people on sales behaviors that are part of the sales funnel to doing those behaviors in the sales funnel on the job, to the outcomes of the individual sales that those generate, to team sales, to organizational sales, to meeting organizational goals, right? And so if you're using something like Salesforce or other things like that, you can track a lot of those behaviors. So you would end up integrating data from the training, which could be surveys, which could be assessments, could be observations, those kind of things, with actual behavioral data and outcome data, and then doing that. And it gives you a very strong case for whether or not the training is actually having the desired impact. And in that case, with sales, you can calculate an ROI, right? And other things that you can't. But that's a very clear line of sight. So when you start to become more on the soft skills domain or more on the attitudinal domain, and it's a less clear impact on specific metrics that companies tend to do. So you have to think about what are what's kind of the chain and how you would expect it to be. And sometimes you can't make that connection directly. So you have to think about what's the most reasonable proxy for it. And so, and I know I'm kind of not answering you. I wish I had an easy answer for your question, right? I wish because if I had that easy answer, I would be selling it to a lot of people in my platform. But I think the idea is that you have a really well-defined strategy and you understand who your leaders are and what they care about, and you do the best that you can to be able to measure the impact of the intervention, training or otherwise, on that on those things that they care about and make your case. I think where I've seen it gone terribly wrong is where people have gone in, and this is for all types of training. I've seen people go in and try to do return on investment where there is not a clear line of sight, or they don't have the proper metrics to do it, and they make lots of assumptions. And in organizations where ROI is easy to calculate, think about buying a piece of machinery or that kind of investment, that tends to get them in trouble and actually works in the opposite direction from what was intended.
So you mentioned, behavioral outcomes, more long-term impact, and just, with the good metrics in general. And so what are some specific variables that should be measured when it comes to assessing whether DEI training worked?
So I think that's a dangerous question to answer broadly, but I think in general, I like to have a layered approach. And so, because a layered approach allows you at different points, what's your point of, when I talk to L&D professionals, I talk about what's your area of control and what's your area of influence. And your area of control are the things that you can have a day-to-day impact on, or an impact on when you make a decision strategically, when you make a decision to change them. So what's going on in your training program? Mostly once people leave the training program, it's your area of influence, not your area of control. And so I always recommend think about who your stakeholders are and what information you need to make sure your program is working the way it needs to work first, because that's check that off, because then if it doesn't have the desired impact, it's not because of the training program, right? And then what are the things that you can measure going forward? And in general, I think the idea of any sort of, if you think about turning learning into performance, or turning learning into behavior, um, or changing cognition, right? And then that changing behavior. What are the things that are important to understand? Well, did they actually learn it? To what extent? Did you know? How did they adopt it, or internalize it? Right? Can they then go and apply it in a kind of a controlled environment? And then the idea of, are they motivated to then go back to do it? Because I've seen lots of training where I've looked at the data from the training, and people clearly learned what was going on in the training, but they didn't internalize it, or weren't motivated to then take it back, and it did not. I don't think have the impact that was desired, right? But I've also seen cases where it has. So I would say, for me, the important ones, I know most people can't measure a lot, is I would want to know how motivated people were, and what their kind of what their intentions to kind of transfer, as we would say, into the work environment. And then kind of think about what some measure of learning, whether or not self-reported or not, depending on what you can do. And then for me, the bigger thing is to measure transfer. I've been working with a number of academic colleagues on models of transfer, and doing some computational modeling of transfer. It's way too technical, but the gist is that those initial transfer decisions are very, very important. So if someone doesn't have an opportunity to use the skill, immediately, it doesn't reinforce the skill or the motivation to do it, right? So I think there's something that's lost in training sometimes, is we don't plan for how it's going to transfer. And so for me, the most important thing, because it gets you to plan for how you're going to actually put it in place in organizations, is to have a transfer plan for the people who are in that, and then the measurement around that transfer plan. The other thing that's very important that I think in particularly with DEI training, is do supervisors and leaders, and just the policies and structure of the organization, support what you're training people in the training to do, right? Because if there's a mismatch there, or there's not an opportunity, or there are barriers, or there's not support to implement it, the training is going to be seen as not valuable, because it didn't, or as something that they just had to do, right? Or it's check the box, or those kind of things. And so I think if you're going to put forward the initiative to train, you've got to really have the structure in place so you get the full benefit of it. And one of the ways to know that or not, that it's working, is to measure transfer. And so that's why I think transfer, regardless of how, and you can define it different ways and measure it different ways, but that to me is the most important.
You mentioned the importance of having a transfer plan. What are some key components of a good transfer plan to ensure that adoption of the learned behaviors back in the workplace?
So I think this goes back to, I've written a lot and worked a lot with needs assessment and training. And so this goes back to understanding, kind of having a good needs assessment perspective on what the metrics in the organization are that you're trying to change are, and what are the key behaviors that influence those metrics, and then what are the requisite knowledge, skill, and other abilities and other attributes that are needed to do those behaviors, right? And then how training plays into that. So you're kind of backwards engineering what you should train. And so if you understand, if the training's been built with a purpose to influence specific behaviors or specific attitudes, or to accomplish impact in a specific way in an organization, then a transfer plan is relatively straightforward, because you would use the same structure to say, okay, great, what did you learn in training? These are the objectives that you should have learned. Okay, how well did you learn them? How do you plan on applying them on your job? And kind of setting it up to various levels of detail. And if there's a clear line of sight between the behavior to the outcome, then I think it can be very effective. And the transfer plan also it's kind of more accountability and motivational in some ways for trainees, and can be an activity that's metacognitive in a way because it gets them to reflect on their learning. So I would always have a reflection period about what they learned in the training as part of the planning process, and then with specific learning objectives, and then how can they apply them, and ask them to think about the potential barriers to it, because we all know if we've got a supervisor that isn't supportive of it, we're probably not going to do it. If we don't have the resources to, like for example, and this is clearer with technology, you've just been trained on a new piece of technology, but your company doesn't buy you that piece of technology to make your job easier, so you can't implement that training, right? So I think there's just thinking about it in very clear line of sight terms. It's an exercise in reflection, goal setting, and action planning at the individual level. That's all it
is. Reflection and goal setting at the individual level. I love that. So for all those learning and development or diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners out there watching, what would you recommend are 3 ways that these individuals can begin implementing more training measurement best practices to their work?
Oh, that's great. So I want to preface this. One of our clients that uses our platform as a branded version is a DEI consulting firm. And, I've learned a lot from working with them and seeing how they operate. And they've been, great. They're a great client. One of the things I would say is, again, approach your measurement systematically, right? Understand what you want to try to accomplish. You don't have to accomplish it all at once, but understand what you're trying to accomplish and initiate the simple steps, right? If you do, and I have over the years, I've worked with lots of folks who just want to do a piece of it, or they don't have a big budget, so what can they do, right? But what I've seen recently, the clients of mine who have gone through the workshop that I do on the AIM model, and think about it, every year when they renew their license with us, they do more, right? They're doing more with their evaluation because they see the value of the piece that they did. So I think part of the implementing an evaluation process is starting to overcome the barriers against implementing it, right? And so one way to do that is to have set a very clear objective and say, this is the first thing we're going to do. And it might not be something that's useful to every stakeholder group, but as long as you've thought about it and you say, okay, the next step will be this, which will be useful to this stakeholder group, and the next step is this, you've got to build your capacity. And so a lot of folks I've seen over the years have been very, they know they're behind in terms of what they see in the learning and development online press type of thing, and all of all leaders say, oh, you should do this and this. Well, you've got to start someplace. Yeah. And so I think jumping in there. The second thing is pay attention to your measurement, and as subject matter experts in anything, we tend to have a very nuanced mental model. And sometimes you forget when you're writing items or doing other things that most people do not have that nuanced mental model. And so trying to keep your items as clear and focused as possible will help you get better results, and have more interpretable data. Because one of the things that I would say is, is being able to interpret data and deliver something clearly is key to doing this. The other thing that I would say is think about giving feedback. The third thing is feedback practice. And you see this all throughout measurement organizations. People talk about, oh, we've got this survey problem, we got to keep the survey really short. Well, the result, or the research that I've seen in my actual experience, says that you get, data quality is not impacted for having longer surveys. And if you've got a motivated group of people filling out the survey, it doesn't happen. And so the idea is we don't have a survey problem, we have a survey feedback problem. Is,
Mm.
in my opinion, is because most people do not see the results of the surveys that they talk about. They don't see the actions that are doing that. And so it's very clear that we need to be communicating what we found to stakeholders when appropriate and what was done. And the idea of allowing people to see their results, I think, is really key. And like our system allows for perspective based dashboards and reports. So the instructor can see this, the learner can see this, the program manager can see this, the chief learning officer can see what she wants to see. You know, if you want to share it with perspectives or some data with somebody else, you can share dashboards. And so the idea for me is, can we get the feedback to people when they need it to make a decision, right? So there's two things. There's the visibility of the information, and it's also getting it to people at the time in which they can use it. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's really important. So those are the three things that I would kind of think about honestly is, you know, in general, kind of I think about measurement and feedback, but those measurement and feedback are kind of pointless if you haven't thought about kind of how the training is supposed to impact different stakeholders and the metrics that they care about in their world, whether or not it's the L&D group or it's the supervisor back on the job or it's the director who's running that division of the company or it's the C-suite. You know, they all have things that they care about in their businesses and the people in their businesses. And so I think building your measurement around that, but don't be overwhelmed by trying to do it all at once. Come in and think about it from a systemic standpoint. There are lots of folks out there that can help you do that. And then prioritize and make your plan, right? These are
Yep.
the things we measure first, and this is how we're going to do it. And we'll add these as we do it.
Well, I could talk about training evaluation all day, but unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. Eric, what's the best way if people want to get in touch with you and learn more about what you do or potentially work with you?
Well, I think the best thing to do is either reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you know I'm easy to find. There's several Eric Surfaces out there, but I'm the only one that does learning and development that I know of. Or to go to alpsinsights.com. We have information there, and you know occasionally I actually go out and speak at different places. So I've got something coming up at the American Psychological Association in August. If you happen to be there. Have some plans coming up for speaking at a couple some other things early next year, but those will be announced on our website.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise. I know I learned a few things about best practices of DEI training evaluation. I'm sure our audience did as well. And thank you for all you do to help us be better humans at work.
Thanks, Victoria. I appreciate all that you do too, and it's always a pleasure